In case we have never met, I'm Michael Price, and I want to help you succeed in growing your business.
Welcome. I'm Michael Price, your host.
And I'm Nancy, your co-host.
Imagine running this elite, super competitive program, right? One that usually admits over 2,000 candidates every single year.
Right, a really steady pipeline.
Exactly. The application is tough, but it's consistent. And then suddenly, literally almost overnight, that admission number just plummets from over 2,000 all the way down to 65 nationwide.
Yeah, which is just staggering.
It really is. And, it's not a glitch in the software. It's not a temporary backlog. It's the result of this massive rewriting of the rules on how the federal government interacts with small businesses.
And, it completely upends the entire ecosystem. Because when you see it drop that catastrophic in a program that's, designed to integrate everyday businesses into the federal economy, you are looking at a fundamental shift in who actually gets to participate in that economy.
Completely. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are unpacking an absolute avalanche of new guidance, court rulings, and federal directives that have entirely transformed how small businesses get capital and how they compete for federal contracts.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but we have a really dense stack of research to guide us today. We're looking at some fresh March 2026 research notes as well as a super comprehensive report by Tenance and Carmona over at the Brookings Institution.
Yeah, and actually, before we go any further, we really need to explicitly set the guardrails for today's discussion.
Definitely.
So, the sources we are analyzing today intersect with some highly politically charged issues. We're going to be detailing the effects of diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI policies. We're talking about affirmative action rollbacks, some really stringent new immigration rules, and sweeping cuts under the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. So we want to be absolutely clear with you up front. Neither of us is taking a political side here. We are not endorsing any of these viewpoints or policies.
Yeah. That is such a crucial distinction. We are not here to debate the politics at all. We are just here to decode the mechanics. Our only mission today is to impartially report the facts, the data, and the ideas contained in this research, just so you can understand the reality of this changing landscape.
Exactly. Our goal is to synthesize the mechanisms behind these changes. We just want to show you how the gears are actually turning.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the rules of the game haven't just been, tweaked.
Yeah.
The entire philosophy behind federal support has completely shifted, and to understand that shift, we have to start with one core threshold question. Under the new rules in 2026, who actually gets to be considered disadvantaged?
Yeah, and that really is the defining question of this entire era. To understand the landscape right now, we have to look at the domino effect that got triggered by a 2023 federal court ruling.
Right, the one that changed the presumptions.
Exactly. This ruling invalidated what were known as race-based presumptions for the Small Business Administration's 8 Business Development Program.
And just for a little context for you listening, the 8 program is this multi-billion-dollar federal tool, right? It's designed to help socially and economically disadvantaged businesses win government contracts.
Spot on. And for decades, the program operated on this sort of macro-level assumption. It presumed that certain minority groups were socially disadvantaged based on recognized historical patterns of racial exclusion in the U.S.
So basically, if you belong to one of those recognized groups, you had a streamlined path to proving your eligibility because the systemic barrier was already legally acknowledged.
Right. But that underlying legal acknowledgement is exactly what the 2023 ruling stripped away. And that set the stage for this sweeping January 2026 SBA guidance, which completely rewrote the evaluative standard.
Wow.
Yeah. So the program moved entirely away from addressing historically patterned exclusion. Now it requires a fact-specific, individualized narrative from every single applicant. You have to prove documented, demonstrable harm to your specific business or career.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here for just a second.
Sure.
On paper, doesn't an individualized narrative actually make more sense? Like, instead of relying on sweeping demographic assumptions, shouldn't government assistance require actual documented proof of a hardship?
Well, yeah. And that is the core argument for the change, right? That it creates a strictly merit-based, evidence-driven system. But when you look at the mechanics of how this is actually implemented, the sheer administrative weight of that proof becomes a huge barrier in itself. It is an incredibly intensive evidentiary process.
Meaning they need a lot of paperwork.
Oh, a ton. A business owner needs objective materials. We are talking about producing specific emails showing denied opportunities, comparative financial data, sworn affidavits, and historical records proving that a specific instance of bias materially affected their education or business advancement.
Geez, it sounds like we've gone from a VIP list based on demographic history to requiring a forensic audit of a person's life experiences just to get a foot in the door.
A forensic audit is the perfect way to describe it, and that audit is totally flipping the demographics of the program. Because under these new race-neutral standards, the January 2026 guidance explicitly directs SBA staff to consider whether an individual has been adversely affected by diversity, equity, and inclusion policies or affirmative action policies.
Wait, seriously? So a business owner could submit a narrative saying, I lost out on a private sector contract specifically because of a corporate DEI initiative, and the federal government could classify that as a qualifying social disadvantage?
Yes. The new guidance allows for exactly that, and the research notes that this reframing drastically broadens the scope of eligibility. It basically allows some white applicants who can document negative financial or professional impacts from DEI policies to claim social disadvantage and enter the 8 program.
Wow. What is the practical fallout of that shift, though? Like, how does it change the day-to-day operation of a program that manages billions of federal dollars?
Well, what's fascinating here is how this redefines the original intent of the 8 program. I mean, this initiative was championed in the aftermath of the civil rights movement as a macro-level solution to help historically excluded minority businesses gain a foothold in federal contracting.
Right. It was about systemic issues.
Exactly. But now the system centers entirely on individualized transactional claims of harm, totally detached from broader historical or societal context.
Okay, I see.
It levels the evidentiary playing field on paper, but it fundamentally alters the profile of who is successfully crossing the finish line.
And looking at the data, almost no one is crossing that finish line anyway.
Yeah, that's the other side of it.
Let's talk about the survival rate of this forensic audit we mentioned. Earlier, I brought up that staggering drop in admissions. Under the previous administration, over 2,100 new firms were admitted to the 8 program in a single year. But by 2025, that number cratered to 65.
Yeah, the bottleneck is just severe, and it's not just a freeze on new admissions either. It's a massive wave of active removal.
Oh, right, the audits.
Exactly. In mid-2025, the SBA launched its first comprehensive audit of the program in decades. And by January 2026, over 1,000 firms were suspended.
Just for failing to provide the new level of documentation.
Mostly yes, because those granular documentation requests are incredibly difficult to fulfill retroactively, and the mechanism of suspension is just brutal. Suspended firms cannot receive new federal contract awards while they appeal.
So they're just cut off completely.
Basically, yeah, a minor procedural error, a missing historical email, or even like a portal glitch during a document upload can completely sever a business from its primary revenue stream overnight.
That is wild, but even if a small firm survives the audit, right, even if they stay in the program, the actual mechanisms that help them win contracts are eroding.
Oh, heavily.
The research highlights the quiet withdrawal of the Rule of Two expansion. Let's walk through how that works. Historically, the Rule of Two requires federal agencies to set aside a contract for small businesses if there's a reasonable expectation that at least 2 qualified small firms will bid.
Right. It acts as a guaranteed seat at the table for smaller players.
Exactly.
But you have to look at where the government is actually spending its money today. A massive and growing share of federal procurement happens through multiple award contracts, or a MAX.
Think of an MA kind of like an exclusive wholesale club for federal agencies. Instead of putting out a public bid for every single project, agencies just buy from a pre-approved list of massive vendors.
That's a great analogy.
So if you don't have the membership card to that specific wholesale club, you can't even see what the government is buying, let alone actually bid on it.
Precisely the issue. And there was a proposed rule to force agencies to apply the Rule of Two to these massive MSC platforms, ensuring small businesses got a piece of the wholesale pie. But that rule was recently withdrawn.
Wow.
So small firms are essentially locked out of the biggest spending vehicles. They're forced to compete on the margins against large entrenched incumbent contractors.
And those margins are shrinking too. The updated federal acquisition language now makes targeted programs like A2A or the HubZone program, which incentivizes businesses in low-income areas. It makes them discretionary rather than mandatory for contracting offices.
Yeah, which is a huge shift.
And furthermore, the government-wide goal for small disadvantaged business contracting was slashed from 15% back down to the statutory minimum of 5%. Combine that with the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, actively canceling contracts across agencies, and the data shows those cancellations are disproportionately hitting minority and small businesses.
Right. The federal pipeline is just narrowing from every possible angle.
Wait, let me push back on this a bit because there seems to be a massive contradiction.
How so?
We hear constantly in the news about cutting red tape, right? The prevailing political narrative is all about making government leaner, more efficient, and reducing the regulatory burden on the private sector. But based on everything we are discussing, for small businesses, the red tape just got exponentially thicker.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the apparent contradiction actually makes perfect sense.
Okay, walk me through it.
The federal government is aggressively moving toward what procurement officers call category management. The goal is to consolidate buying power into fewer massive centralized contracts to save the government money and administrative time.
Okay,
And that is highly efficient for the federal buyer.
but terrible for the small supplier.
Exactly. To operate in an environment of category management and these intense evidentiary audits, a business needs massive internal administrative, legal, and accounting capacity. You essentially need a dedicated compliance department.
Right, which costs a fortune.
And larger established incumbent firms, which statistically remain predominantly white-owned, have that built-in capacity. Smaller firms with thinner margins just cannot absorb these demands. So the red tape is indeed being cut for the federal agencies, but the administrative burden is simply being transferred onto the small business trying to prove its eligibility.
That makes total sense, and that brings up a really critical point about cash flow.
Oh, absolutely.
Because even if a small firm somehow navigates the MSEs, survives the brutal 8A audit, and wins a fractional contract, they now face a completely different hurdle, funding the upfront work.
Right. You need money to make money.
Exactly. You cannot execute a federal contract without capital to pay your employees and buy materials. But just as the government locked the front door to contracts, they've also changed the locks on the bank.
Yeah, they really have.
The federal lending landscape is going through an upheaval that completely mirrors the contracting side.
The credit squeeze is palpable right now. The SBA's 7A and 504 loan programs are the primary engines for federally backed small business loans. But the new guidance has radically altered the eligibility criteria, particularly regarding immigration status.
Let's get into that.
Yeah, so legal permanent residents, individuals with green cards, are now completely excluded from these lending programs.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that zero-tolerance policy. The business has to be entirely owned by U.S. citizens or nationals without exception.
Not a single exception. If there is any ownership stake by a non-citizen, even like a 1% equity share from an early angel investor, the entire firm is disqualified from federally backed credit.
That's incredibly strict.
Very. And this surgical change specifically targets immigrant-owned businesses and mixed ownership firms, abruptly removing their primary federal credit backstop.
And for the firms that do meet the strict citizenship requirements, the underwriting standards have tightened dramatically across the board anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The threshold for a simplified loan review dropped from $500,000 down to $350,000.
And, that might sound like a minor bureaucratic adjustment to some, but in practice, it means a standard loan to buy, say, a piece of heavy equipment now triggers a multi-month heavy documentation review rather than a streamlined process.
Right, and pre-screen credit scores also jumped from 155 to 165. Startup equity injections are mandatory again. And we really have to talk about the loss of the do what you do rule.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Because that was a regulation that allowed local lenders to use their own discretion and establish risk models to approve federally backed loans. Now, it is mandated to be entirely centralized SBA criteria.
Which removes the human element of community banking. I mean, a local bank manager might know a business owner, understand their local market, and, trust their track record, despite a minor credit hiccup. Centralized algorithms do not factor in local trust.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We need to look at the baseline data from before these new strict rules even kicked in.
Let's hear it.
In 2024, Latino-owned businesses accounted for 12.5% of approved 7A loans, but only secured 8.3% of the actual loan dollars. Meanwhile, white-owned businesses captured 45.7% of the loans and nearly 40% of the dollars.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so minority-owned businesses were already getting a disproportionately smaller slice of the capital pie under the old, more lenient system. If the federal bank door is closing, where do these businesses go for capital now?
That is the critical vulnerability in the entire system right now. Tonantzin Carmona's research at Brookings frames this perfectly. Financing for small businesses operates in a layered structure.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, when conventional federal loans tighten and push businesses out, those borrowers fall to the next layer down. Historically, that safety net was mission-driven lenders like community development financial institutions, or CDFIs.
Right, the local orgs.
Exactly. These are localized organizations specifically designed to serve borrowers who are overlooked by traditional commercial banks.
But the research notes that the CDFIs are currently struggling to keep their own lights on.
They are under severe administrative strain. The federal CDFI fund is facing staffing cuts and massive delays in dispersing capital to the local organizations. And because CDFI funding works on multi-year federal cycles, when the central administration slows down, the local capital pipeline dries up almost immediately.
So they can't help the businesses falling to them.
Right. So if the SBA algorithms reject you and your local CDFI is stalled waiting on federal funds, marginalized businesses fall through to the final layer, online non-bank lenders.
Do you mean the fintech apps and the high-interest alternative lenders?
Yes, exactly. And you know they are highly accessible and they approve loans quickly, but they charge significantly higher borrowing costs and fees.
Which just eats into their margins even more.
It creates a localized debt trap. Instead of building equity, small businesses are just servicing high-interest debt, which actively widens the broader economic wealth gap.
Which feels like the ultimate crushing irony of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
Just as the rules become incredibly complex, the documentation requirements skyrocket, and the loans get exponentially harder to secure, the Federal Help Desk is essentially shutting down. The safety net that was supposed to help small businesses navigate this labyrinth is shrinking.
Drastically. We are witnessing a systemic collapse of the support infrastructure.
Give me an example.
Look at the Minority Business Development Agency, the MBDA. This was an agency dedicated specifically to providing technical assistance, helping minority entrepreneurs navigate federal procurement, and running a nationwide network of business centers.
Right?
It has been operationally dismantled. Federally funded center work has been completely halted.
And the SBA itself is drastically reducing its footprint too. They announced a 43% workforce reduction for 2025.
Yeah.
They've physically relocated and consolidated 6 major regional offices. They pulled people out of Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, New York, and Seattle.
Yeah, the boots on the ground are gone. The local hands-on, in-person assistance that a small business owner relies on to figure out a highly technical 8A application or, like a complex MEC bidding process, it simply does not exist in the same capacity anymore.
So what does this all mean if you're listening to this right now, whether you own a small business, you work for a local company, or you're simply a citizen watching how your government chooses to spend its massive budget? Why does this administrative reshuffling actually matter to you?
This raises an important question about the fundamental future of entrepreneurship in America.
Yeah.
Because when a government dismantles technical assistance while simultaneously increasing technical requirements, it isn't just changing a policy mechanism, it is changing the demographics of who is allowed to participate in the economy.
Absolutely.
Without a federal help desk, navigating the system basically becomes a luxury good. The ability to participate shifts, favoring only those who already have the capital to hire private compliance consultants, specialized accountants, and procurement lawyers.
It privatizes the pathway to federal support. It creates an ecosystem that inherently favors the incumbent.
And that is the overarching theme of the research. The federal policy shift we are witnessing has fundamentally moved away from addressing group-based systemic barriers. It has moved toward a highly individualized, compliance-heavy, and fiercely competitive model.
Which sounds fair until you see how it plays out.
Right. In practice, that model heavily favors well-resourced, established incumbents and U.S. citizens. It is completely reshaping who gets federal money, who wins federal contracts, and ultimately, who gets to grow.
The barrier to entry has never been higher.
Yeah.
And the federal ladder designed to help you climb over it has essentially been pulled up.
It creates a landscape where resilience isn't just about having an innovative business idea or, a strong work ethic. It's about having a phenomenal compliance strategy.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with today.
Let's hear it.
We spent this time analyzing how the federal government is consolidating its business, favoring these massive, well-resourced incumbents, and making federal support incredibly difficult to access for new, diverse, or disadvantaged players. If this heavily fortified, compliance-driven landscape is the permanent new reality, does the traditional small business dream eventually have to decouple from federal support entirely? Will the next generation of diverse entrepreneurs realize the public infrastructure is closed to them and be forced to build a completely parallel ecosystem I mean their own private lending network, their own localized contracting platforms, just to survive? It's a massive question, and how the private sector answers it will likely shape the American economy for decades to come.
It really is the frontier of the new economy.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive to unpack the new rulebook. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.
A special thank you to MarketUS.com for furnishing us this information. You can reach them at MarketUS.com or call them at 954-636-3232. Before we go, this deep dive was created by the MarketUS.com team. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's right below the subscribe link.
If you found this video helpful, please consider donating to helpallvets.org. Thank you.